Actually, I have to admit, I'm actually relishing this moment because anytime a repressive regime is squirming and is panicking because it fears the wrath of its own citizens, that's a moment that I actually celebrate. And I'm hoping that might produce democratic openings where there could be a breakthrough, perhaps another Arab Spring moment. And so ironically, Trump doesn't think through these issues, acts very impulsively, thinks we're still in the 19th century and you can just do these things.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Alwaleed, editor-in-chief of Muftah magazine, and I recently sat down for a conversation with Nader Hashemi. He's a political theorist with a focus on the Middle East, and he's currently the director of the Alwaleed Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University, where he's also an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics. Professor Hashemi received his PhD in political science at the University of Toronto and is the author of several works including Islam and Human Rights, Islam, Secularism and Liberal Democracy, and Sectarianization. That latter work, Sectarianization, was the topic of our conversation, and it wouldn't be the first time I've interviewed him on this very topic. 8 years ago, at the site of the Middle East Studies Association conference in Washington, D.C., I interviewed him and his co-author, Danny Postel, on their new book, for Muftah magazine. If you're interested, you can read that interview on our website. Just visit muftah.org and navigate to the archive tab. The book's argument is fairly straightforward. In a word, it's that sectarianism in the Middle East today has a very recent history that's explained by authoritarian regimes manipulating identity cleavages to extend their expiring shelf life. This process by which the authoritarian regulation of sectarian tension occurs, Professor Hashemi calls sectarianization. The book came out during the twilight of the Arab Spring, and it seemed to have a lot of explanatory power in that moment. But nearly a decade later, the politics of the region are quite different, especially in the aftermath of October the 7th, and I wondered whether the sectarianization thesis was still relevant. In a moment, you'll hear me ask Professor Hashemi that question as we try to situate sectarianization in the present moment. But before we begin, I want to take a moment to just say how important your support is to this podcast. To those who already support us on Patreon, thank you for making this episode possible. If you haven't already joined Protean View as a supporter on Patreon, you can do so for as little as $5 a month. With your $5 monthly contribution, you get a free subscription to the magazine, and if you'd like to upgrade your support, you can receive a number of additional benefits, including a custom coffee mug, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, early access to episodes, an invitation to our Discord server, and even an ability to select our next guest on the show and what questions we ask them. If that sounds good to you, visit us at patreon.com/proteanview. You can also find out more on our website, muftah.org/protean-view. Thanks for listening and for your support. This is Protean View. So, Nader, your book with Danny Postel, Sectarianization, was published, 8 years ago now, in the twilight of the Arab Spring, and it both diagnosed the landscape of Middle East politics at the time and offered a grim prognosis for the future. A lot has happened since then. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe it's been almost a decade, but I wonder whether you think the sectarianization thesis still holds up and how relevant it is to our current moment. And before you answer, maybe you could just briefly explain what the sectarianization thesis is for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. In the immediate aftermath of the crushing of the Arab Spring, so I'm talking about roughly 2013, 2014, we saw a significant increase in the rise of sectarian tensions in the Middle East that, in my reading and in the reading of the book that I edited, was directly attributable to the Arab Spring revolts and to the crisis of authoritarian rule that those revolts produced for, ruling elites in the region. And it's not just Arab countries, I'm talking about Iran as well, because Iran was a key participant in this equation for broadly similar reasons. So just observing the rise in sectarianism and sectarian tensions, specifically in Iraq, but also critically in Syria and across the Persian Gulf, where Iran and Saudi Arabia were key sort of protagonists, the existing explanations and analysis of this particular phenomenon, which was a somewhat new development in the Middle East, but it had a history. There was a gap in trying to sort of theoretically and politically and historically sort of explain the whole question of Sunni-Shia conflict. So that was the genesis of the book. And we tried to say something new about the topic. And so we coined this term sectarianization and tried to sort of compare and contrast it with the more ubiquitous term that was used in the media and by a lot of people in the region, sectarianism, which I think in Arabic is, the term is ta'ifiyya, that was just sort of bandied about without any sort of analytical rigor or sense of history or sort of the politics behind it. And the idea behind sectarianization, as opposed to sort of sectarianism, was that it was a concept and a process that was shaped fundamentally by political actors operating within specific political contexts who were pursuing specific political goals that involved the mobilization of people around specific identity markers. In this case, the identity markers were sectarian identities, Sunni and Shia. In the book, we talk about the role of class dynamics, of fragile states, of the geopolitical and international contexts that contribute to the sectarianization process. And what we really wanted to do was sort of push back against this idea of sectarianism, which sort of suggested that this was just an enduring and unchanging feature of the politics of the Middle East or the Islamic world, and that allegedly existed as some sort of trans-historical or static force that was deeply connected, allegedly, to the identities of Muslims, Sunni and Shia, and it had no sort of changing characteristics to it. So that's sort of the entry point. And of course, one of the things that we identified as central to the sectarianization thesis was the theme of political authoritarianism. And of course, if you know anything about the politics of the Middle East, and of course the Arab Spring, which was a key sort of moment here, it was, unfortunately, the politics of the Middle East for a very long time has been characterized by deep and expanding authoritarian rule. And we argued in the book that we put together that it was really authoritarianism and not theology that was the critical factor in understanding this phenomenon of sectarianism, or more accurately, sectarianization. And we wrote that authoritarian regimes in the Middle East have deliberately, at key moments in time, manipulated sectarian identities as a strategy for deflecting demands for political change that were coming from below to perpetuate political rule. And so one of the formulations that we came up with in the book was that, you can't understand sectarianism, or more accurately, sectarianization, without understanding the question of authoritarianism. And so to paraphrase that famous line that you read about in international relations theory from the Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz, who famously stated that war was a continuation of politics by other means. In our formulation, we write that sectarian conflict in the Middle East in the post-Arab Spring era was primarily about the perpetuation of political rule by ruling elites via identity mobilization. In this case, the identities are Sunni and Shia identities. And so one of the things that we tried to sort of do in the book is to make the argument that, look, this question of sectarian tensions has a history. If you don't know the history, you don't know really what you're talking about. And so the key sort of marker in terms of the history of this is 1979. Prior to 1979, there is very little evidence of significant Sunni-Shia sectarian tensions in the region.
Just tell us why 1979 for listeners who may not be familiar.
So 1979 is a key moment when the Iranian Revolution happens and a pro-Western monarchy is toppled by a political Islamist movement that was challenging authoritarianism, that was arguing that there needed to be an alternative form of government in Iran, drawing upon Islamic sort of ethical concepts and demanding a voice for the people, etc. That event was a hugely transformative event in terms of the politics of the region, the Middle East, and it sort of sent shockwaves to other pro-Western monarchies in the region, also backed by the West, who feared that what happened in Iran, this rising tide of political Islam, would then come to their own countries and topple the existing ruling elites that were there. And so one of the, I think, responses or strategies that we saw, and there's a lot of documentation that proves this, is that Saudi Arabia, being the most powerful country in the region, started to deliberately ramp up and promote a decidedly anti-Shia sectarian narrative and spread this across the Islamic world as a key strategy for diminishing the appeal of political Islam coming out of Iran, which the Iranian revolutionaries always claimed was a decidedly, their revolution was decidedly non-sectarian. The leaders of Iran went out of their way to claim that, look, Sunnis and Shias, despite their theological differences, have sort of shared grievances, shared enemies, a shared vision. But the strategy from Arab authoritarian regimes was to sort of spin a completely different narrative. And this had quite a bit of impact and influence. It sort of sunk deep roots. Just on a personal level, I'm old enough to remember that after 1979, things started to change within Muslim communities. I was raised in a Muslim community in Canada, the city of Toronto. Our family was one of the few Iranian communities, Shia communities, but we were deeply integrated into the mainstream Muslim community, the mosque that we went to, the Muslim school, the camps. They were all sort of, just mainstream Sunni communities. And growing up in the 1970s, there was zero evidence of any hostility, tension, discrimination, paranoia, anxiety over these issues. After 1979, you can start to see these things slowly creeping in, largely as a byproduct of what I would describe as a deliberate attempt by Saudi Arabia and its allies to promote this type of narrative. You start to see this type of conflict on university campuses. You start to see sort of people who don't know really, the history and the politics behind it, just, drawing upon, I think, a lot of ignorance and misunderstanding, regurgitating stereotypes and myths about this. And I can see that personally in my own life in terms of the community that I'm from. But, politically, you see a rise in sectarian tensions after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And that lasts for roughly a decade. The Iran-Iraq War was central to this story. It helped Saudi Arabia mobilize sort of sentiment and support for Iraq and its prosecution of its war against Iran to try and isolate it and contain it. But when the Iran-Iraq War ends in 1988, you see a gradual and slow rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And what's interesting to see is you also see around the same period a diminishing of sectarian conflict and acrimony throughout the region. And so, in other words, the point that I'm making here is that one can almost trace rising sectarian tensions in the Middle East to the state of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the 1990s is actually a decade where you have diminished sectarian tensions. It's not, as I just said a moment ago, a coincidence that this is the moment when Iran and Saudi Arabia sort of have somewhat of a détente in their relationship. 2001 is the other key moment where things move in a very different direction and sectarian tensions start to increase. And of course, that's 9/11 and then 2003, the American invasion of Iraq, where as a result of that invasion, you have Shia political parties supported by Iran, sympathetic to Iran, coming to power in Iraq because they had the numbers, and Saudi Arabia and its allies freaking out over this new political situation where historically Iraq was not controlled by these Shia political parties that had sort of revolutionary or somewhat sort of, pro-Iranian sympathies coming to power, shaking up the balance of power. And then you see a rise in sectarian tensions once again. It's not just a function of Saudi Arabia. You have the emergence and the expansion of al-Qaeda that tries to deliberately stoke sectarian tensions in Iraq through a campaign of, mass murder, effectively, deliberately trying to sort of provoke mayhem, and things then take off in a significant direction. And then the other key moment is the Arab Spring, where 2011 happens and Arab authoritarian regimes are deeply shaken. And Iran is also deeply shaken in another way. Iran is very worried about what's happening in Syria. So they play, in the context of Syria, the sectarian card to mobilize a pan-Shia sort of militia movement, drawing upon, the sentiments and a narrative that they sell to these poor Shia communities that your Shia holy sites are under threat in Iraq and primarily in Syria. You have to come to the defense. And so Iran plays that card to advance the interests of its regime. Saudi Arabia plays also that card to advance the interests of its regime. One of the key battlegrounds that this plays out is in Bahrain, where you have an Arab Spring uprising. It basically revolves around the demands for democracy, accountability, inclusion. But the Bahraini royal family, drawing upon support from Saudi Arabia, crushes that uprising, playing and drawing exactly from the playbook of sectarian identity politics, and claiming that the uprising in Bahrain has nothing to do with democracy, accountability, human rights, but it's all about Iranian sectarian plans to take over Bahrain and subjugate it.
Okay, so this gives us a good sense of the sectarianization thesis, the background to it, and also a good broad history from 1979 to 2011. But what about now in 2025? As I said earlier, things have really changed in the decades since the book came out.
So now we're in a different moment. I mean, we can see right now largely because the politics of the region have changed in significant ways as a result of the war and genocide in Gaza. That's the focus of the politics of the region. And as a result, you've actually seen Iran and Saudi Arabia, again, go back to a period of détente, of rapprochement, of trying to sort of have better relations. That's not what's dividing the region right now. What's dividing the region is the genocide in Gaza and the complicity of Arab states and the complicity of the West, and that's the big focus. The last thing I'll say is that if anyone wants to understand this topic, one also has to have a bigger sense of the 20th century history of sectarian relations, and I'm talking about what was the focus of politics in the region for much of the 20th century prior to 1979. And if you know anything about the history, the politics of the region in the Middle East prior to 1979 was very similar to the politics of the region in many sort of countries in the global South. It was the struggle for independence, the struggle for decolonization, the struggle for autonomy and independence from external. That was the common theme that united and organized people. And in that context, people of different identities in the Middle East were united around a common sort of set of themes that brought them together. There's very little sectarian, tensions to report or identify in that context. And even in the context of, the post-World War II period, you actually see Saudi Arabia and Iran on the same side of the politics of the region because they were both pro-American sort of regimes that were united in opposing what was then the radicalizing sort of movement for political change that was coming out of Arab nationalism led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. And so you have this interesting phenomenon in the context of the 1960s. There's a civil war that breaks out in Yemen, and Iran and Saudi Arabia are on the same side of that war, opposing the Republican forces backed by Gamal Abdel Nasser. After 79, as I said, politics moves in a different direction.
I suppose someone listening to this might think, well, yes, the genocide in Gaza has taken center stage and has reshaped the politics of the region. But at the same time that we're seeing Saudi Arabia and other governments try to move away from the type of sectarian politics you mentioned, that hasn't necessarily meant a reduction in sectarian tensions on the ground, right? In some cases, those tensions have arguably gotten worse. So perhaps you could address that briefly and maybe elaborate on why Gaza is the primary issue now.
Those sectarian tensions are still there. I think they still exist. They can easily be mobilized again if ruling regimes feel it's in their interest to do so. So that's always a factor. As we write in the book, sort of really that the interest in sort of mobilizing people around certain identities is a reflection of a certain vulnerability that authoritarian regimes feel at a moment in time, and they derive certain benefits from sort of playing that type of political game. Right now, I think things have shifted significantly, where the key sort of concern now for Arab states is not the threat from Iran or the threat of the Arab Spring sort of movements and demands for political change spreading. But the key threat now is how this genocide in Gaza is starting to destabilize and generate a level of anger and animosity in the region, primarily at Israel and its Western backers, but increasingly, with ruling regimes who have stood by and who have done absolutely nothing. In many ways, I think I would make an argument that they have been deeply complicit in the genocide in Gaza. Let's not forget that Egypt sort of shares a border with Gaza and has kept that border sort of closed and sealed in the interest of its alliance with Israel and the United States. So that's the big destabilizing sort of theme right now. And now, of course, it's been heightened because of Trump's morally obscene plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza and send these Palestinians in Gaza to Egypt and Jordan or somewhere else. And now, as we speak, there's a big scramble among these Arab states to try and deal with this crisis, knowing that they're being pressured somewhat from the United States, but they're also, I think, fundamentally being pressured from their own societies over 15 months of genocide, the attempt to now ethnically cleanse Palestinians, which, really speaks to the core of the pain of the people in the region, this idea of mass expulsion, right? I mean, the Nakba is so central to the identity of people in the region, to Palestinians. It highlights the worst of the colonial imperial legacy. And there's a general sense that was in the past, but now it's very much in the present, because the United States under Donald Trump, and I would also argue under Biden as well, are very much interested in this idea of removing Palestinians, sort of keeping alive and reminding people of the worst horrors of the colonial and imperial era, which is not a moment in the past. It's very much now in the present. So I think the argument that we make in the book is that the fundamental, I think, cleavage that shapes the politics of the Middle East today, the key dividing line is not Sunni Shia, it's ruling regimes, autocratic leaders versus their own societies. How do you manage that sort of equation? How do you keep people sort of in check? This is why I think Jordan feels so vulnerable, because it's probably the weakest of the authoritarian Arab states. It has a significant Palestinian population. And if any of these Arab states are going to fall over what's happening in Gaza, it's going to be probably Jordan number one, because the regime is not as strong and as draconian as the other Arab states that can sort of crush popular opposition. And so that's why you sort of have seen since October the 7th, 2023, Jordan really being outspoken over these issues, in my view, not because there is a deep sense of empathy and solidarity with the suffering of the Palestinians. These are what we're seeing from all of these Arab states is just a strategy for regime survival, right? And how do you sort of deal with that anger and deal with this sort of problem that isn't going away? In many ways, it's getting worse. So this is the dynamics that are at play here right now. And it has to be stated that if any of these Arab states had an iota of sympathy for the Palestinians, they wouldn't have, starting with Egypt during Camp David in the 1970s, and then Jordan, and then the Abraham Accords, all of them one by one, cutting separate deals with Israel, throwing the Palestinians under the bus, breaking the previous sort of solidarity and consensus that existed at one time in the Arab world, primarily to preserve the longevity of these regimes by strengthening their alliance with the West and Israel. That's the calculation. Now, interestingly, this issue of Palestine, which these ruling Arab states thought that they could avoid, thought that it was a thing of the past. I mean, this is very much, if you actually recall what Jared Kushner was saying when he announced the Abraham Accords, he was saying that, look, when I go to the Arab world, no one's talking about the question of Palestine. The Arabs don't care about Palestine anymore. What he was really saying is the Arab dictators don't care about Palestine. The population certainly did. And so we can move forward and we can sort of have these deals. But now, because of October the 7th and because of what Donald Trump is proposing, the question of Palestine has come back to haunt these Arab dictators. So as we're speaking, all of these Arab states right now are in a scramble to figure out what are we going to do to respond to Trump's ethnic cleansing plan? What's the counter proposal? And there is no good counter proposal. And so the question of Palestine now, unbeknownst to Arab dictators, but I think very much known to people who study the region at a grassroots level, the question of Palestine is central to the politics of the region.
Part of the reason I wanted to revisit the sectarianization thesis with you is because of Gaza. Because over the last year, I've encountered people who either live in the region or are from the region originally, that say, you know what, Palestine, it's a tragedy, but it's not our core problem. Yes, the genocide is happening next door, but I've got a number of problems on my own doorstep that are more pressing. And I'm more concerned with the Shia militias in my country, or I'm more concerned with Iran's power in the region. And we saw hints of this after the fall of the Assad regime, right? Now, Ahmed al-Shara, Syria's new leader, he was quick to call Iran and its proxies a regional threat shortly after taking power, but he has said very little about Israel comparatively, right? Even as it bombed Syria and encroached on Syrian territory and captured a number of areas and towns in the south. I mean, some have said, can you fault the new government? I mean, it's trying to survive under highly inauspicious conditions, and it has just survived a brutal decade under the torment of Assad, Iran, Russia, the United States, etc. I mean, what's your take here?
No, I agree with that. I think, look, there's a lot of things that are happening in the region. It's not just Israel-Palestine. I mean, one reason why I think Israel-Palestine, or why the question of Palestine is so central to the identity of people in the region, is because it is deeply connected to the core theme of the region, and not just the Middle East region, but the Global South region, the theme of the struggle for independence and decolonization. This was the big theme of the 20th century. And the question of Palestine keeps that issue alive because it's one of the few remaining regions in the world where the final borders are yet to be determined, where ongoing colonization and settlement activity in our face is continuing. And under Donald Trump, it's been heightened to new levels where they want to engage in a mass expulsion plan, exactly going back to the 19th century where these things were done quite frequently. So yes, that theme is still there. It hasn't gone away, but the Middle East is afflicted by a lot of other problems as well, problems that are rooted in people's economic security, growing sort of poor prospects for the future related to unemployment, related to environmental catastrophes. So there's a lot of problems in the region. What we saw is that during the Arab Spring, the question of Palestine somewhat diminished from the radar screen because of all of these issues related to authoritarian governments, attempts to stop the Arab Spring. So people are rightly, I think, focused on what's happening in their own societies, what's happening sort of within their own sort of territory that they exist in. But the question of Palestine is never that far away from the equation. Now it's been elevated because of the mass atrocities that have taken place. So two things can exist at the same time. People can be rightly concerned about what's happening in their own country. I think it's completely understandable, in my view, for Ahmed Shara to say what he has been saying about the threat of Iran and Shia militias, because it was Iran and those Shia militias and Russia that were responsible for the mass atrocities that we saw, for most of the mass atrocities that we saw in Syria post-2011. So that's completely understandable. The question of Israel, of course, is interesting because you're absolutely right to say that these new rulers in Syria have diminished or sort of downplayed. I was actually shocked. I remember exactly where I was when a reporter was asked, this British reporter was asking the spokesperson for the HTS government what he thought about Israel's growing encroachment and massive bombardment of the military installations and supplies of the Syrian army. And he deliberately tried to avoid the question. He didn't want to engage. It was clear this was coming from a directive where the new rulers of Syria were saying, look, we want recognition from the West. We don't want to antagonize Israel. But, Israel was acting in such a grotesquely offensive and predatory way that eventually Ahmed al-Shara had to sort of come out and make a statement that we oppose what Israel is doing. We want Israel to withdraw. But from his perspective, and I have deep sympathy for this, the focus for Syria now, if you know anything about what's happening in Syria, is survival. The socio-economic, humanitarian needs of the people of Syria after 54 years of one-family rule and roughly 10 to 15 years of a brutal war are so dire that Syria can't stand at this moment, to pick a fight with a regional hegemon that is very aggressive, has the backing of the West, and can do basically what it wants. But eventually, there's no getting around the question of Israeli policy and occupation of Syrian territory because it's foundational to the whole question of the future of Syria. The Syrian government lacks sovereignty over its own territory. Turkey controls a part of it. Iran, until recently, was deeply influential. The Kurds are sort of an independent unit. And Israel has been in occupation of Syrian territory since 1967, and now it has expanded its control. So one of the big challenges of the future of Syria is how do you lay claim over sort of the territory that you rightfully believe is yours? And that's eventually going to set up a confrontation with Israel. But I completely understand why this is not the time to sort of pick a fight with Israel. But that issue is not going to go away because, Israel is a neighboring state, and what Israel has been doing, not just to Syrian territory, but to Palestinians under Israeli control, is so central to the identity and the politics of the people of the region that there's no way of avoiding this as a theme. It's eventually going to be a problem that the rulers of Syria are going to have to deal with. But I understand this is not their priority at this moment. I completely get that.
Coming back to something you said earlier about why authoritarian governments pursue sectarianization, as I understand the argument, one of the things that these governments do is attempt to manipulate identity cleavages in order to regulate how their populations behave in response to the urgent political questions or concerns of the time. So, a government may want to direct its population's attention away from something and therefore introduces sectarian tension as a way to accomplish that, right? So explain to our listeners why these governments haven't pursued that strategy after October 7th, even as they've sought to denounce the attack itself and Hamas in particular. It seems like maybe a ripe opportunity to say, hey, look, Iran is behind this whole thing. They support Hamas. If it wasn't for them, this whole thing might not have happened.
Very simply, it's tough to blame Iran and Shia militias for what Israel and the United States are doing in Gaza. It's pretty clear, who's doing the bombing, who's doing the killing, who's backing it, who's justifying it. It's Israel, it's the West, it's the United States. And so I guess if you're an Arab dictator and you want to sort of change the conversation, it's easy to sort of play sectarian games here. But, you can't blame Iran and you can't blame Hezbollah, who were at least rhetorically and to a certain extent militarily trying to sort of come to the defense of the people of Gaza, at least in their own rhetoric, right? So it was just a bridge too far to do that. Interestingly, what did happen and what has happened is that the one political constituency that did sort of try to play not really the sectarianization game, but tried to sort of shift the conversation over what's happening in Gaza were right-wing Zionists and members of the Republican Party and pro-Israel hawks who sought to explain October the 7th and up until today still do try to explain the problems of the region by saying it's all about Iran. Iran was behind this. Iran has to be dealt with. Marco Rubio just the other day in Israel said that the number one factor for instability in the Middle East is Iran. And this is very much the worldview of Netanyahu and his, American supporters. That's the narrative, right? If we can only get rid of Iran, then we'll have stability and peace in the region. And I think that's very much the ambition that they have under Trump, is if they can convince him some way to extend this sort of forward plan that they've had, almost crushing Hezbollah, almost getting rid of Hamas, although it's pretty clear Hamas is still very much alive. Assad is now gone. And then Iran is next. And there's this naive view in Israel that, somehow if Iran can be removed from the equation, then, the conquest of the West Bank and Gaza will be much easier. There is a certain sort of logic there, but I don't think it's a convincing one. But I think that's very much the plan.
I think there are a lot of people in the region that share Rubio's views about Iran. And I know we had just said a moment ago, we inhabit a sort of a different moment now. But I was recently talking to a Lebanese guy who told me that he thinks Iranian power and influence are the biggest problem in the region, bigger than Israeli belligerence in the region. And he even celebrated Israel's invasion of Lebanon. It's his own country, in the hope that it would eliminate Hezbollah. And, this isn't some John Bolton type war hawk we're talking about here. He's someone that's been, as far as I know, a lifelong supporter of the Palestinian cause. But as he has slipped deeper and deeper into his sectarian world, a series of bizarre and startling political commitments begin to emerge. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that, I take this example to represent a broader pattern there are plenty of people who share these kinds of views today. He's hardly alone. And I wonder whether it's a sort of genie out of the bottle situation. Like, even if these Arab governments don't come back to the the sort of rhetoric that emerged post 2011, post Arab Spring, where the sectarianized language was like ramped up to the max. I mean, people are still really committed to their sectarian worldviews, and it really animates so much of their politics.
No, that's a good observation. Yeah, there are constituencies, obviously, in Lebanon because of the dominance and prominence of Hezbollah that view Iran's role and Hezbollah's role through a certain sectarian lens, and they have overlapping interests in terms of what the United States and Israel is saying and their own political situation within Lebanon. You can also apply that to Syria. You can also apply that to Yemen. There's a certain sort of sense of satisfaction when Iran gets beaten back or when its allies are diminished by virtue of Israeli military action. That's all completely true. And those identities are there. And there's a certain sort of, I guess, logic to that, because if you're Lebanese and you're on the opposite side of the political equation in Lebanon, where you're critical of, what Hezbollah and the power and the influence that it wields over the political system, then there's a certain sort of, sympathy that you have when some outside force comes and weakens it or diminishes it. So those identities are there. I think those are more, they do overlap with sectarian identities. I think those are more just political grievances that draw upon a certain sort of sectarian narrative. But it's important to point out these are not theological disputes. One of the things that often, outsiders misunderstand is they think that, look, sectarianism in the Middle East is about these ancient historic blood feuds that go back to the 7th century and are still playing themselves out today. At the beginning of the book, we go through a long list of statements of people, mostly United States politicians and intellectuals who know nothing about the history of politics of the region, who actually believe that the reason why there's conflict in Lebanon or the reason why there was conflict in Syria or in Yemen is because of what happened in the 7th century after the death of the Prophet, when some people decided not to sort of support Abu Bakr as the leader of the Muslim community. And that's the origins of this. So what you said about this person that in Lebanon, makes perfect sense, because there are these legitimate grievances, and Iran is a major power in the region. It's a somewhat diminished power, and it's had a lot of influence over these countries that it has a political and military presence. Lebanon, Syria, no longer, but at least up until recently, Yemen, and also Iraq. The same thing can also be said about the situation in Iraq, where Iran has considerable influence by virtue of the allies that it supports. So all of those things make sense. And so those identities are still there. I don't think there's anything you can do about it. I think one needs to think creatively outside of this box. I don't think there's a military solution to these questions, that hoping that somehow Israeli intervention in, let's say, Syria today is going to solve the problems that Syria faces with respect to Iranian intervention. One has to think, I think, in more sort of more democratic ways of how one sort of resolves these questions, where you have people who have different agendas, different backgrounds, different identities. How do you sort of share a common political space and do so in some sort of equitable and fair manner, where people from different groups will have a seat at the table and will be able to sort of coexist in a way that's equitable, just, and democratic. That's the challenge of, I think, all societies where you have people who come from different backgrounds and who want to share the same political spaces. How do you come up with a political arrangement where everyone feels that their basic rights are respected and protected in the context of a functioning legal system and in the context of a functioning economy, where people, feel that they also have a fair economic future in the political society that they live in. Those are the big challenges of the region.
To your point about theology, if I understand you correctly, you're not saying that theological commitments aren't instrumentalized or aren't a factor in sectarian conflicts. What you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that in the background, politics animates all of that. And that if those political conditions weren't there, those theological grievances or claims, they would likely take a different form. Is that it? Or
That's exactly correct. And because one question you have to ask yourself is when you're trying to explain a political or social phenomenon, you have to ask yourself the why now question. Why at this particular moment in time are we seeing the manifestation of a particular phenomenon? In this case, sectarianism, heightened tensions between Sunnis and Shias, and not before. How do we explain that? And then also the other related question is how do we explain the variation in geography, where in some parts of the Muslim world where you have Sunnis and Shias coexisting, you see heightened tensions, in other parts you don't. Like, for example, there is Sunni-Shia coexistence and populations in India where there's very little tension. There's also Sunni-Shia coexistence in neighboring Pakistan, where there has been heightened tensions. And if you read the chapter in our book by Vali Nas, who very much focuses on the question of sectarianism in the context of Pakistan post-1979, he sort of lays out an argument that overlaps with the thesis of the book, that there are political interests, there are state actors that are pursuing political projects that benefit from mobilizing these identities at a particular moment in time when it's to their political interests an advantage to do so. So what you just said is absolutely the core of the thesis.
Okay, we only have about 15 minutes left, so I want to shift gears here and talk about the Trump plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza. What do you think is going to come of that plan? And specifically, what do you think Jordan and Egypt are going to do in response to U.S. pressure on this matter?
Just a bit of background. We had a panel the other day on this topic, and I asked the panelists to provide some historical context to the plan. Surprisingly, none of them identified the core of the plan as really a byproduct of long-standing sort of aspirations, especially in right-wing Zionist circles, to sort of, complete what was done in 1948, get rid of all the... This has been a long-standing theme since October the 7th in Israel. They've been openly discussed. And now Trump is very much taking that project and running with it. The other key element of the story here that people forget is actually the first outline of this plan was given about a year ago at Harvard University when Jared Kushner was participating in this event with Tariq Massoud at the Kennedy School. And he was, asked what he thought about Gaza. And he actually laid out the blueprint of the plan. He said, it's a great investment opportunity, a lot of great waterfront property. The only problem is we have this population that's there. We got to get rid of them. So it's pretty clear to me, I don't know the backstory, but I'm almost certain that, Kushner came up with the outlines, developed it further, gave it to Trump. And he was reading from a text when he announced this on February 14th at the press conference with Netanyahu. And so this has sort of now created a huge problem for, American allies in the region, particularly Jordan and Egypt, which Trump has explicitly said they should take these people. And now they have to come up with a plan. There's going to be a meeting, I believe, today in Riyadh or next week in Riyadh, and then an Arab summit. The challenge for these Arab dictators is the following. They're caught between a rock and a hard place. They're caught between their alliance with the United States and Trump, which they want to keep, and which is also an alliance with Israel now, because all of these countries have, either diplomatic relations with Israel, or even in the case of Saudi Arabia, they wanted to, MBS wanted to jump into bed with, Netanyahu just prior to October the 7th. That's one pressure. Then the other pressure that they're having is their own populations, right? Even in Saudi Arabia, there's a famous statement that came out a few months ago where MBS said, look, I don't really care a lot about the Palestinians, but the problem is that 99% of my population do care about it. Egypt and Jordan are specifically vulnerable because those are the countries that Trump has identified as countries where he has a lot of leverage over because of U.S. aid. And those are the countries who should take in these Palestinians. Those two societies now, and those two regimes now, face the wrath of their own people. That, how can we even entertain this idea of mass, expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza, which, under international law is a clear war crime. This has destabilized these countries. So they have to come up with a plan. I don't see any plan that's going to make Trump happy. What's interesting about what Trump said on February the 4th is that every single time since the February the 4th, when he laid out when he made the announcement, he was asked about it, he's doubled down on it, saying, this has to happen. And the Palestinians can't come back. And why would they want to come back? Because we're going to build great homes for them somewhere else. So this is clearly on Trump's agenda. So I don't know how. I have to admit, I'm actually relishing this moment, because anytime a repressive regime is squirming and is panicking because it fears the wrath of its own citizens, that's a moment that I actually celebrate. And I'm hoping that might produce democratic openings where there could be a breakthrough, perhaps another Arab Spring moment. And so ironically, Trump, who doesn't have, doesn't think through these issues, acts very impulsively, thinks we're still in the 19th century and you can just do these things. The reports that we have is that, Egypt has some plan that seems to be popular, that they're going to come in and sort of create some safe zones within Gaza so that people don't have to leave, and they're going to rebuild it. But of course, the issue that we have to talk about, and this is actually perhaps a subject for another podcast, is the big issue for these Arab states and for Israel and the United States is, what are you going to do about Hamas? Hamas is still very much there. They're probably, Blinken said before he stepped down as Secretary of State, they've able to recruit as many fighters as they've lost. So in other words, they have the same numbers that they had on October the 7th. And so how are you going to sort of come up with some sort of Arab state reconstruction plan? Let's say that's on the agenda, that explicitly, in the reports has no Hamas participation. It'll be just Palestinian technocrats and some people from the Palestine Authority. How are you going to implement that plan when Hamas is still very much in control? So I don't see a way forward. I think the tragedy of this moment, though, and this came out in the panel that we did the other day at Georgetown, the tragedy of this moment is that because Israel effectively has control over Gaza, or at least veto power, and because the Arab states are, I think completely incompetent and unable to come up with any serious plan that is that can lead to reconstruction and redevelopment, and because Trump is living in his own world, the sad reality when you put this all together is that the fate of the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza looks really bleak. I don't see an opportunity or much hope for them, given all of the different scenarios. They're not going to leave. You can't forcibly expel them. Hamas is still very much there. Israel is still very much in control and has almost still, strong support from the West, perhaps even more support from the United States under Donald Trump. So it raises the question, what realistically can be done to help the people of Gaza, given the balance of forces in the region and internationally? And the reality is it doesn't look like there's any, clear plan. No one's going to step in. Theoretically, China could do it, but China's not going to step in, and neither is anyone else. So when you look at it from that perspective, unfortunately, all of the options look very bleak. And the most realistic scenario is that you're going to just see slowly but surely this population of 2 million people, dying in front of our eyes. And I hate to say that, but that's what it looks like to me. And so, this will, I think, produce long-standing consequences for the politics of the region. I'm reading Pankaj Mishra's book right now on the world after Gaza, history, where he does say that this is one of the key moments of the 21st century. It is a transformative moment. It's going to have long-standing consequences, not just internationally, but regionally. This is, in many ways, much worse than the 1948 Nakba. One, because the number of people killed is much larger, and it's also televised, right? And people are seeing it, feeling it. So the political consequences are going to be enormous. I can't predict exactly how it's going to play out. But one thing for sure is that there are millions of young people in the Arab and Muslim world who are being radicalized by what's happening in Gaza right now. And let's not forget that, Sayyid Qutb, was radicalized by 1948. Osama bin Laden was radicalized by the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And in many ways, what we're seeing today is much worse than those two periods of time. So the consequences will be, I think, enormous. That's why I think, this moment is historically significant and transformative, but one can't sort of predict what will happen next.
And on the point you made about the wrath of populations of Jordan and Egypt, is that wrath Do you think that wrath would come from integrating so many Palestinians into those countries, into those societies, or from the idea that their governments would accept to participate in the expulsion of Palestinians? Because two reasons I ask this. The first is those populations have for the past year, over a year now, witnessed as we have this genocide occur with little response to it. And the second thing is that there are a lot of commentators in the West, analysts in the West, talking heads really, who say nobody wants the Palestinians, not even their neighbors. Nobody wants these people. These are like they're the ugly duckling of the world, and that's why these populations are so dismayed by the prospect of taking in the Palestinians, because, like us here in the West, they don't want them either.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that always has to be mentioned in the context of this conversation about the future of the people of Gaza, every conversation on this topic should begin with the foundational fact that the vast majority of people in Gaza are refugees from 1948 who under international have the right to go home. The fact that we can't even have that conversation in the West, and the fact that they can't go home, tells us a lot about, this particular topic. And the reason why these Palestinian refugees can't go home is because the West is committed to the prospect of an ethno-religious supremacist state in Israel, which is an apartheid state now, according to every human rights organization that's looked at it, and the West is committed to that proposition. So that's where these Palestinians, I guess, if we had a just world, should be able to return to. In terms of the wrath question, I think it's a complicated set of factors. It's not just one factor. I think the underlying sort of structural factor that explains why there's so much anger and resentment in many Arab societies today is because the political and social and economic conditions are so horrific for the vast majority of people. Economic conditions, worst authoritarianism that we've ever seen in the history of the region, mass poverty, mass pauperization, ruling elites unable and unwilling to share control. That's the underlying sort of anger that people feel, okay? Frustrated, people can't migrate, people more difficult to, just one measure of this, I was following this for a previous book project of mine, just look at the number of, if you chronicled the number of suicides that have been taking place. People just can't make ends meet. They can't pay their bills. The level of humiliation and anger and resentment, and on top of all of that, we have a new factor that is leading to mass poverty and suffering is the environmental conditions are changing in very negative ways because of global warming. And the Middle East is disproportionately affected by that. So it's a terrible situation. On top of that, you have the genocide in Gaza, and you have all these Arab countries basically doing nothing. Objectively, if you want to sort of speak about it, they're actually supporting Israel in different ways, and we can go through the list of how they've been contributing to Israel's war effort. And now you want to kick out these people from Gaza and send them to neighboring Arab countries. So the wrath is a wrath that is partially because of the long-standing, humiliation of the Palestinians and their dispossession that go back to 1948, the anger or the resentment of the legacy of colonialism, which is still ongoing. That's a factor. But it's also, I think, the much more immediate factor is the moral bankruptcy of the political rule of these authoritarian regimes, which are presiding over their populations, and every year life gets worse. And so when you put this all together, it's a cauldron of anger, resentment, animosity that could easily explode. Egypt economically is a basket case. The level of poverty, the level of misery, the level of political repression has never been this bad. And now if you follow what's happening in Egypt, and I'm not following it that closely, I'm just sort of reading the reports, Sisi is trying to sort of present himself now as the champion of, Palestinian nationalism, and we're not going to be humiliated by this, Israeli-American plan, and we're going to stand up, and we're not going to sort of, we're going to come up with our own plan. But I think the roots of the anger and the resentment is a combination of all of these factors. Fundamentally, it's a function of the anger over the, growing despotism and authoritarianism of these Arab regimes presiding over populations who are, suffering and feeling the pain with every passing decade. And then on top of that, you've got the question of the humiliation and the suffering of the Palestinians and the inability and refusal of these Arab states. Now the Arab states are coming together. People are saying to come up with a plan. Well, where were you for the last 15 months? And the answer, actually, objectively, is all of these Arab states, at least privately, if you listen to what's being said, they were basically saying, look, Israel finished the job, crush Hamas. We don't like this story. Get it off our radar screens. I mean, that's where these Arab states were in many ways. So, I mean, that's, I think, my read of what's happening right now.
Okay, a final question here, and it's broad, so you can take it in whatever direction you like. We've seen a sort of social awakening on the question of Palestine here in America. Things have obviously changed in terms of the discourse, but at the same time that mostly young people have become aware of the grimness and depth of the suffering of the Palestinian people, we've also seen a quite stark reaction from a number of prominent individuals and institutions on the issue of Palestine. So just in the academic scene, for example, Maura Finkelstein comes to mind. She was a tenured academic at, I think, Muhlenberg College, and she was fired for speaking out on the issue of Palestine. And something similar happened recently as well with Catherine Frank at Columbia University. So where do you see things going in this country when it comes to Palestine, both in terms of the discourse, but also politically?
Yeah, that's a good observation. You're absolutely right. There's greater awareness, sympathy, solidarity for Palestinians at a societal level, particularly among young people. I mean, there's a lot of evidence right now to suggest that Harris lost the election because of her policy on Israel and Palestine. Had she been a bit more equitable and fair, things could have been different. But the way it works is, not difficult to fathom. At a societal level, at a grassroots level, whenever there's a public forum, strong sympathy and support for Palestinians. But as you go up the power ladder in American politics, as you go up from your local town council to the state level, to the congressional level, to the senatorial level, and to the presidential level, the more you go up, that's where, the Likud lobby dominates and is deeply influential. And that also applies to the case of university colleges and campuses. So faculty, student, there's a lot of sympathy and support for the suffering of the Palestinians. But when you get to the level of the office of the provost and the president, that's where pro-Israel donors and the Likud lobby have a lot of influence. And that's exactly why I think we've seen something in the whole history of the question of academic freedom that was completely unpredictable and almost, unimaginable if you just prior to October the 7th, that 3 presidents of the top universities in this country lose their jobs over the question of Palestine and free speech, and as a direct result of, pro-Israel donors putting pressure on universities to toe pro-Israel line. So I think what we're seeing right now is I think, some of the biggest threats to freedom of speech and academic freedom happening on university campuses as a direct result of the question of Israel and Palestine and what's happening in Gaza today. This is going to shape, in many ways, I think, the future of questions of academic freedom and freedom of speech on campus for the foreseeable future, because, this moment is, as I said earlier, a transformative moment, a watershed moment, where everyone is sort of playing for keeps, as they say, and it's not going to go away. And so we're seeing these, people losing their jobs. And I think it's a power play, right? It's a question of who can mobilize the most resources to push their side forward and to win this battle. And unfortunately, for those of us who care about, justice and equality and, human rights for everyone from the river to the sea, not just for one particular tribe, but for everyone, we don't have the economic resources and the political clout that our adversaries have. What we do have on our side is we do have the numbers. I think we have international law, we have human rights, we have truth and justice on our side. The challenge is, how do you mobilize those resources and win these battles? So I see this, shaping the future of academia, of civil society in the United States. And things are going to get much worse, I want to point out, because the Trump agenda, is very much geared toward shutting down the Palestine solidarity movement, shutting down freedom of expression on university campuses, on a lot of other issues, dealing with, critical race theory and other themes, but specifically Israel-Palestine, using and instrumentalizing the argument that what's really happening on university campuses is rampant and uncontrolled anti-Semitism. We have to stop that. And so we're going to crack down on these colleges and universities and force them to pay a penalty in various ways in order to put an end to the Palestine solidarity movement. That's basically what's happening. So this is a transformative moment. I think these issues are not going to go away, and there's a lot to talk about. And so it's great to have this, opportunity to share some thoughts with you on these important themes.
I'll have to leave it there, but I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Nader.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions at proteanview@muftah.org. Whether you're tuning in on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, we'd appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of the show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org/protean-view for more information on our upcoming episodes, and follow us on our socials using the handle @ProteanView, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.